From lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota, and 6footmama.com, this is Still Growing with Jennifer Ebling. Still Growing is a gardening podcast dedicated to helping you and your garden grow. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Still Growing. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. I have another great show for you today, but first I'll cover just a few of the usual housekeeping items before I get started. Don't forget you can check out the show notes for Still Growing over at 6footmama.com. That's my website, and it's the number 6ftmama.com, and you can find the Still Growing podcast in the top menu, and then just scroll down to episodes. Or head on over to iTunes and give me a review and get the show there. Or if you happen to be listening on Stitcher Radio, hit that little thumbs up button down in the corner. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, so a little bit about what's happening around here as usual. My sun kitchen garden is doing fabulous. It's on the south patio deck. I'll have photos and a blog update on that later this week. And I'll also talk about how to keep your kitchen garden fresh and address things like bolting and how to keep going with your direct sowing. I planted a second kitchen garden on my front porch on the northwest side, and this garden gets about 5 to 6 hours of morning sun. And by getting that done this week, it's going to really demonstrate to any doubters out there that there is still much that can be planted and harvested with a part shade location. I'll post those pictures and the story later this week. Finally, like you, our 4th of July plans are taking shape. This year, we're heading to a local restaurant on the lake for supper, coming home for a movie night featuring Independence Day, which was a request from the little boys, and then throwing on the glow lights with the kids and heading out to catch the fireworks. Our front porch is decked out for the 4th, and this week I'm featuring a simple patriotic newel post that you can make to add some structure and architecture to your garden, and that will be on my blog on 6footmama.com just in time for the 4th of July. Now, for the focus of my show today, which is part 2 of my interview with Don Engebretson, the Renegade gardener. For those of you who maybe missed last week's show featuring part 1, I recently interviewed Don Engebretson, the Renegade gardener, with my fellow master gardener and friend Mary Lynn Knight. And we had so much fun chatting with Don and learning from his many years of gardening experience that we realized we had enough material for 2 shows. So we split the show into 2, or split the interview into 2 pieces. And in part 1, which aired last week in episode 503, we learned how Don came to be known as the Renegade gardener. We also discovered his unique approach to gardening, his tips and tricks for educating yourself in the field of gardening, and his advice for new gardeners, along with many, many other fascinating facts. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, you can go ahead and check that out as well. In today's show, we cover the back half of our interview, which is going to be part 2, and it will provide even more great detail about Don's Renegade perspective and experiences with gardening. It's a great listen, and I think it will really help shape your perspective on the life-giving aspects of gardening, especially as we head into hot summer weather in our gardens, and also help combat garden fatigue if you've really been overdoing things this spring. So let's listen to this good advice and sound wisdom from none other than Don Engebretson, the Renegade gardener. Don, what is the most flawed idea that's currently being peddled by popular gardening culture?
Oh, well, beyond what we've already discussed, just the dumbing down of American gardening, that gardening is easy and plants are foolproof and, blah, blah, blah. The most flawed ideal, we can keep it short, because I think I've mentioned it already, the most flawed ideal is that you can have a low maintenance landscape, or that, I'll pick on concrete a little bit. Concrete retaining wall block. I'm a big fan of concrete pavers. Don't get me wrong. And I install I work primarily in natural stone, but times being what they are, I will, in fact, I'm We're installing a concrete patio probably starting next week. But I prefer stone. And concrete is cheaper, but this, I just see these ads for these monoliths, just these massive retaining wall patio, are great, pizza oven, fire pit, just absolute garden room monstrosities, and the entire thing is made out of concrete. And even though concrete's gotten a little better, they're starting to mix it with aggregates, and they're creating some semi-natural color blends. But you do that in stone, and it's night and day different natural stone. So I think the heavy reliance on plastic products, concrete retaining wall block, just the whole cheaper faux trend. I mean, I understand if people have a budget and they want to do a patio and they can't afford stone. Stone's going to run, 30, 40, 50% more than concrete. But just the sort of ephemeral nature of some of these products, it's something I think you learn to appreciate, or maybe not. Maybe you do a concrete retaining wall block, you think it looks great. Just because I think it doesn't mean you're wrong and I'm right.
Yep. Despite all of the marketing geared toward making gardening seem simple, easy, maintenance-free, there seems to be a lot of anxiety when it comes to gardeners and gardening in general, doesn't there?
Beginners, yeah. Yep. And that's the fault again of the gardening industry, because when you say, "Oh, it's easy," here's the common name. Don't learn the Latin. That's old-fashioned. I mean, there are even plant catalogs out now that have stopped using the proper botanical Latin and just rely on common names. But so when you tell people, "Oh, these are guaranteed to grow," or garden in a box, where you just order up the three, it's a paint by number kit. The perennials show up and it comes out with a little design plan and it tells you exactly where to plant them. Well, it's the same as a paint by number kit. I mean, you can go out and buy the paint by number kit of the Rin Tin Tin dog or the kittens with the ball of yarn, and you can sit and fill in all of the ones with blue and all of the twos with brown and all of the threes with red. And when you're done, you have a painting, but have you learned how to paint? Are you going to frame that and hang it on your wall? I mean, no, you're not developing any skill. So the whole dumbing down of it, to try, you see, and what happened is they're trying to get people interested in gardening again. Oh my goodness, people have stopped gardening. Gardening does skew older. I mean, what they're not getting is the same influx of 20-year-old homeowners and 30-year-old homeowners in the gardening as they used to. And part of that's natural. I mean, part of that's just because there's so much of an expansion of society and of things to do, and there's more options. But what the gardening industry decided to say was, "Oh, we're going to tell everybody that gardening's easy and that plants grow all by themselves and that that it's foolproof and da da da." So they took that route instead of saying, "No, here's what we need to do. We need to educate. We need to have classes at our nursery. We need to have much better informed salespeople. We need to do seminars. We need to educate people about how to grow stuff and the great benefits of gardening and develop gardeners." Instead, they took the easy way out, and I think they're continuing to burn off people, particularly younger people, from gardening because they aren't even told, they aren't even asked, "How's your soil for this plant?" You know?
On that note, I'm curious what your thoughts are on social media, sites like Pinterest, where it's very visual. Do you have any thoughts or insights into how social media is changing gardening?
I think it's helping. I mean, Pinterest and some of these things where you can shoot off pictures and get followers or get a group that does it. And certainly Facebook. I mean, I use Facebook a lot for my people can like me. They can go like Renegade Gardener on Facebook because I shoot out gardening tips and photos of the projects that we're working on in addition to my website. I think overall it's just good and it helps. because it's just another way for people for exposure. People fall in love with gardening, or they become interested in gardening primarily visually. It's visiting a friend's garden, or driving past a beautiful neighbor with a lovely garden, or seeing landscapes in film, or when they travel around the country. So it is a visual seduction initially in gardening. So anything that, because so many of the social medias are visual, I think they're going to help.
And when people see other people's yards and they want to start their own landscape project, what steps in the do-it-yourself landscaping project is most likely to be overlooked or underestimated?
Visualizing the landscape as a whole. Homeowners think too small. You want to start landscaping or prettying up your yard, so you go out and you circle the mailbox, with flowers. And now you've got a sunny spot on the fence over there, so you want to go stick some landscape there, and then you cut a circle in your yard and you fill it up with annuals, and then you go over to the front door and you plant something, and then you buy a garden bench. You don't know where the garden bench is supposed to go, but you plunk it down here, and then you buy a bird bath. You do all the little things first. You think too small. You break up beginning gardeners and homeowners. I see it all the time. They break their properties regardless of lot size. We could be talking about a small city lot. We could be talking about a 1 acre or 2 acre suburban lot. But they look too small, and they break it up into little individual areas, and a pocket garden here and a pocket garden there, and they circle the tree with bricks and fill it with white rock, and they put flowers in, and they create all of these numerous disjointed little garden features, landscape attempts all around their yard, and because they're doing them individually, one at a time, it never pulls together as a cohesive, unified whole. That's the number one design mistake that homeowners make. They think too small.
Okay, so tell them the solution. Coach them on how to think bigger.
Well, it'd be tough to do in this short amount of time, but you need to learn about concept lines. Concept lines are the lines that the eye sees and follows when it gazes at a landscape. Your house footprint is a concept line. Your street is a concept line. Your driveway is a concept line. Your sidewalk is a concept line. However, the most prominent concept line, the one that the eye sees first and most readily exists, is the concept line created by the plants, or if there is lawn involved, it's the line created by the edging that separates the lawn area from the landscape area. And, you really need to, buy books, go online, learn the basic, at least spend 10, 15, 20 hours. And my website has a ton of this stuff, but other good books and other good websites talk about visualizing the yard as the property as a unified whole. Plant your trees first. You buy the house. First thing you got to evaluate is your tree situation. Do you not have enough? Do you not have enough trees? I mean, you might get the trees in the ground first. 15, 20 years later, you're going to be glad you did. So you do have to learn the basics of landscape design, and there are plenty of outlets out there. But and the nursery industry is horrified when someone points that out to people, and yet they don't realize that someone who falls in love with fly fishing, I mean, they have to learn how to cast a fly rod. They have to learn how to do a roll cast. They have to learn how to match the hatch. Sewing, golf. All it is a learning curve. I don't know why we're supposed to protect people from the horrible truth that there's quite a bit to learn here before you're any good at design.
Those are great points, Don. And yet, when you think about gardening, which has been a fairly straightforward endeavor through the ages, why now has it just seem like it's gotten so complicated for people to figure out, some very basic gardening concepts.
I don't know that people make it complicated as much. Well, I mean, everything's complicated if you're not going to learn the basic tenets. I mean, landscape design is complicated to people because it's complicated. I mean, landscape design isn't easy. You can't just go out and buy a bunch of plants and plant them willy-nilly and have a beautiful landscape. You have to learn about contrasting foliage colors and you have to learn about form and foliage of plants and the biggest thing for a landscape designer, the thing I'm so much better at now than when I started, is I can see plants 15 years from now. I mean, when I plant a landscape, I'm planting it, and the homeowner says, "Oh, that's lovely." Well, that's lovely now, but I'm looking at it as it's going to be in 10 years, and that takes just a bit of experience in getting to know your plants and having plants in the ground that you see 10 years later.
That's a great quote too. Being able to see plants 15 years from now.
Yeah, you have to be able to see the tree and the shrubs as they are going to mature. I mean, because another big faux pas, you just reminded me of it when I teach my classes. Homeowners are pretty good when it comes to height. And when they're looking for a tree or they're trying to figure out a blooming shrub, they want to buy 3 of them or 5 of them to put them in front of a bay window, but they don't want something that's going to grow taller than 4 feet. They're always height oriented, and they're pretty good at learning mature height. The question they forget to ask about plants is, how wide is this thing going to grow? I would say more homeowners misplant or screw up their attempts because they don't plant with a thought towards mature height, particularly as it comes to evergreen trees, evergreen shrubs, large shrubs. Perennials you can screw up, and you can always just dig them up and divide them and space them out wider. But when you're planting you're planting a spruce, or you're planting a white pine or a red pine, I've seen homeowners plant a Black Hill spruce in a little patch of dirt the spruce is 4 feet from the fence, and they got a fence on 4 feet on one side, and it's got 3 feet to the driveway on the other side. Well, the Black Hill spruce is going to grow 16, 18 feet wide. I mean, something's going to have to give eventually, and it's probably going to be the spruce.
Yeah.
There are other much more columnar evergreens that you could plant in a 7-foot area that are going to go 25, 30 feet tall, and they'll only grow 7 feet wide. But you didn't think about width when you planted the white pine in your front yard 4 feet from the road, or the red pine, or the even deciduous trees that get planted too close to stuff. You got to figure out what's this thing going to look like in 5 years? What's it going to look like in 10 years? How big is it going to be when it matures in 25, 30, 40 years?
And that's training that needs to start very young, because I even know my kids are doing gardening projects in school. I work with kids all the time. We're always talking about how tall is this plant going to grow, but we really don't talk about how wide the plants get.
Right. Don't focus in on width. And then you run into the further confusion that the catalogs guess. I mean, I wrote a column recently about shrub sizes in catalogs. Well, it says the shrub will, copper tina 9-bark or something, maybe, the famous one was Dart's Gold 9-bark, listed in all the catalogs as 4 to 5 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet wide. Well, you drop a Dart's Gold 9-bark, if it happens to be the right soil, maybe it just happens to be the absolute perfect pH, and it just loves it there, and it gets a lot of sun. I mean, I've seen them hit 8 feet. So the catalogs, and of course the catalogs are written, and they don't change the heights necessarily by zone. So sometimes that helps us, because we'll have shrubs here that don't grow quite as gangly and as tall as they might out in zone 7, out in as Washington or Oregon or, British Columbia and Vancouver, and they actually look better. But there are other shrubs, you happen to pop it in and you just happen to nail it in terms of the soil and the pH. And, people complain, they say, I remember the Hakuro Nishiki willow, which was supposed to get, I think it said 5 feet tall when that first came into our realm here. Everyone was planting Hakuro Nishiki willows. Well, the things will grow 12 feet tall.
Yep.
It's a willow.
Yep.
I mean, I've coppiced. I have a client where I planted 3 of them, and I didn't know. I trusted the catalog. Mm-hmm. And 10 years later, I'm out there with a chainsaw. I mean, the base trunks on this willow were 6 inches in diameter, and I coppiced that thing to the ground. I mean, I took that thing all the way back down to the hardwood, 6 inches above the ground. One winter, and the next spring, of course, it just popped buds all out of there. And for the next 5 years, they had a beautiful 3 foot, and then 4 foot, and then 5 foot, beautiful Hakuro Nishiki willow. And eventually, it's going to hit 10 feet.
Yep.
And you just coppice it again. You're going to learn. You're going to learn pruning. You're going to want to learn pruning techniques. You're going to, or at the very least, people write a check and have someone come over every 5 years who knows what he or she is doing, and take care of these plants. Unless you're living out in a rural area and you plant a bunch of natives and you let them rip, that's a good look too. I'm not saying it always has to be highfalutin, fancy cultivars, but if you want an attractive showcase type landscape, stuff's going to get ragged on you. It's going to get winter kill. It's going to get sun scald. It's going to get disease. It's going to have insects come in and wipe portions of it out. It's going to require maintenance, and that's a great secret that the nursery industry is trying to hide. And that's again, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. That's where people go, oh gosh, this is tough stuff. Well, no, it isn't tough stuff if you'd planted it the first year and gotten to know the plant and given it 15 minutes of your time every year since.
Mm-hmm. I know you've got a passion for containers, and every time I go to a container class or even start talking to anybody about containers, I always hear about the thriller, filler, spiller rule because it's everywhere. I'm just wondering if there's anything more you can offer to how to make a great container than just thriller, filler, spiller.
Yeah, and I've heard it described as pillar, filler, spiller, pillar being the tall plant in the middle, filler being the mid-sized plants that you plant around it, and then spillers are the trailers in a medium to large container that you plant right along the edge that then spill out over. And that's a beautiful recipe. I mean, some of the most beautiful containers you'll see professionally done are pillar, filler, spillers is the way I've heard it talked about, and I teach that in my container gardening classes. But then I point out some subtle nuances. If it's a large container, and let's say it's in the corner of the patio, or it's placed such that you really only view it from one side. If it's a larger container, plant it like a gardening bed. The tall plant, the pillar at the back, and the fillers in front of it, and the spillers off the front. In other words, gradate it shorter to taller as you would a garden bed. The pillar doesn't always have to go in the middle. The most important thing on container design, and my class is taught just from the standpoint of my 20-some year experience of doing. When I did my first containers, they were dreadful. They looked like everybody else's containers. What was my problem? I thought that what do you plant in containers? Flowers. Every plant has to bloom. Then you start looking at really great containers, and you realize that it's the same principle as in landscape design. Flower color and bloom color and flowers are a secondary concern. The principle to container gardening is to have drastic and artistic contrast in foliage. So I tell people, for every 2 flowers that you plant in a container, your favorite annuals or whatever, for every 2 flowering plants, you plant one strong foliage plant. And immediately your containers will jump up several notches in artistic beauty. As flowers come and go, they fade. You fill up our containers with annuals, and then in July, we all know what they look like.
Yes.
Particularly last year. Creating beautiful gardens, and this applies to perennial gardens, and it applies to planting shrubs, is place plants based on contrast in foliage color and plant form. Bloom and bloom color is a secondary concern, and it takes a long time for people to learn that and understand it and appreciate it. But anytime you see a garden in a National Gardening magazine, or you go to the Arboretum, or you go to your Phipps or wherever you go, some famous public garden, or you tour the gardens of Europe, or you Google great gardens, take a close look at what you're looking at, and you will see that it is the foliage contrast between the shrubs, the perennials, the trees, and the form, the rounded form, the spiky form, the blousy form, the spreading form. Those are the key elements that you need to contrast and play with. Bloom color, you can have a bloom palette, that's fine. You want stuff that blooms in white and blue and pink and yellow, that's great. It's okay to have a bloom color palette, but coordinating bloom color is a secondary concern in landscape design, and it's a secondary concern in container design. The other key principle I'll give you real quick on container design is the simplest trick in the book is once you start getting into mid-sized and larger containers, think about the plant, what I call the plant visual weight, container visual weight ratio. Too often I'll see people, they've got a 3-foot tall, kind of a narrow, tall container, beautiful container, glazed pottery or something, but it's rather tall. Maybe it's, 2, even taller, 3 feet tall. And they'll, it's in the shade, so they'll plant it with impatiens, or it's in sun and they'll plant it with Johnny jump ups. Well, they'll plant it with something that only grows a foot tall. So you look at it and the thing's all container and not enough plants. You want to plant stuff in a container so that the plants create at least 60% of the visual weight. The container that you see should be secondary. The easiest way to do that, too, is to just do it by height. If you have an 18-inch tall container, plant something in it that's going to hit 36 inches or taller, and then your fillers and its spillers. So you've got, when you look at the total container arrangement, it's 2/3 plant height, 1/3 container height.
Yep.
This is why when you're walking around a mall or you're at the airport or you're at a big office building, there's this giant 4-foot container. What has it got in it? It's got an 8-foot tree in it.
Yes.
So you go 2/3 plant height, 1/3 container height, and all of a sudden your containers just start looking beautiful. Then start mixing in strong foliage. Don't rely so much on flowers.
Yeah.
Start using strobilanthes and of course coleus. I mean, people get it with coleus. Why are you planting coleus? For that dumb little blue stupid flower that comes up midsummer that you should pinch off? No, you're growing it for the leaves.
Absolutely.
So when you go to the nursery, take your first spin through the nursery, spend 2/3 of your budget on all of the lovely annuals and perennials. Don't forget to put perennials in there. Spend 2/3 of your budget on your flowers, and then go back and make a second pass and just spend 1/3 of your budget on all the cool foliage plants that you see.
One of the prettiest containers I've seen this year is right outside of my kid's orthodontist office, and they have this ginormous planter, and one of the filler plants they're using is Boston fern. And it just struck me as so unusual to see this Boston fern, which I always consider to be a, kind of a solitary thing that I put in urns or in my hanging pots. And so to see it in a container, I just fell in love with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And grasses. I mean, that was the great thing. 20 years ago, 20 years ago, you went to a nursery. You could go to some of the most popular nurseries in your area. You wouldn't see a single tall grass for sale. And, what did you stick in the middle of your fake plastic terracotta container? You put that spike plant. Remember the spike plant? That dumb little weedy green thing?
My mom did it all the time.
Oh, yeah. And then you circle it with 3 red geraniums.
Oh, gosh, you knew. And a little asparagus fern. Yeah, and a little asparagus fern. Well, luckily, now we can grow tall, beautiful
formula. And all of a sudden containers started getting better. And then we started, adding more foliage to our containers. When you see a really knockout professional container and you're somewhere out, like you mentioned, or if you're in a little city or somewhere or there's a coffee shop or someone and they've had professionals do their containers for public display, go in there and dissect it, take a look. You're going to see right away that there's about one strong foliage plant for every blooming plant. And it isn't just filled up with blooming annuals.
Well, Don, now that you're in the season of landscaping, and I know from your website that you're about a month behind, what does your typical day look like this year when you're out doing your landscaping?
Wet, cloudy, cold. We had a rainy today. In fact, we had absolute thunder shower. We're working on a really cool landscape terrace stone wall job in St. Paul, and it wasn't supposed to rain today. We weren't supposed to have 6 hours of thunderstorm, so I hadn't even tarped it. I had to get up this morning. It was pouring rain. I ran out there and had poly and tarped the whole thing, just so that because we'd already killed the grass in the yard, and I didn't want rivers to form and wipe the whole thing out. But it's interesting. My season this year is gangbusters. I mean, I don't know where these people were last year, but this year I'm 8 weeks out right now. We're getting just a ton of requests, and it's just cyclical. And some of it's old clients who call you up out of the blue and they're ready for something else, or they've sold their house and they're moving into a new house. So that kind of stuff happens. But right now the season is finally going beautifully. But it's funny. I'm out. I still out do a little bit of maintenance. I got most of my maintenance done, but I'll still be in a. Here it is, June, whatever it is, 12th, 13th, and I'll be out in a landscape that I've done, and the evergreens are just barely popping. They should have popped on May 20th, May 15th. Mm-hmm. So stuff's slow, stuff's cold. The ground is still. I don't know what the tomatoes are going to be like this year. I mean, typically people plant tomatoes too early anyway across America, unless you're living way down south, because tomatoes are a hot weather plant and they don't like to go in the ground until the ground's at least 58, even better at 60 degrees. So our soil temperatures are up over that now, but stuff's cold, stuff's wet, stuff's being real slow. Lilacs are blooming, of course, and Forsythia came, and the magnolias had a good bloom season, but and the crab apples weren't that great up here this year. I thought that probably had something to do with that weird cold start.
Yeah. Yep, and things seem to bloom for a shorter amount of time this year as well.
They do that. Yeah, and they do that when they have a cold spring. The sap isn't flowing, the sun isn't shining, the plants aren't. Everything's going to be fine. I mean, what the old saying, every spring in Minnesota is unusual. Everything's going to be fine, but it's going to be a short season up here across the Midwest, and actually across a lot of the country. We're not the only people that have had a long, cold winter and a very sluggish start to spring.
We may not get any tomatoes this year.
It'll be interesting. They don't like cold. Mm-hmm. That's a hot season. That's a hot season crop. Potatoes and peppers, they want it hot. And we haven't had any heat yet.
So for the landscapes that you're creating, are there recurring themes that you have in your landscapes?
I try not to, no. No, I mean, it is dictated. I mean, it's dictated by the client. I mean, I will typically submit a lot of plants and check them. I just was sitting down with a client the other day who nixed a bunch of plants that I think are fabulous, and they're from Australia. And, I have another client who I can't get an evergreen into her yard to save my soul, and she's from the deep south. And she said to me, she finally said, this beautiful Southern accent. She said to me finally, she said, I'm from the South. I know what you mean about, because, winter interest and this and that. But she said, I don't have an appreciation for evergreens, and I'd rather have blooming, blousy. She wants magnolias, and she wants hydrangeas, and she wants stuff, and that's great. I mean, I appreciate the input. She doesn't want evergreens. She says, I don't care what it looks like in the winter. I want it to look like the South in the summer. So there you have it.
If she's from the South, she's probably not going to go out in the winter anyway.
No, probably not.
Yeah.
How have your landscape designs evolved? Are there themes you found compelling earlier in your career that now no longer seem intriguing to you?
Well, again, when you break it down into themes, I guess I don't think in terms of themes. I mean, I take a look at it as just an opportunity to showcase the house. To me, effective landscaping should nestle the house in nature. I mean, that's what I've always said. I want to make the house look attractive. You don't want to cover it up. I don't think in terms of themes when I landscape. I'll do what I think fits the landscape, and I love boulder outcroppings. But there are if I'm landscaping a house right in the city, or South Minneapolis, or something in a very, very urban setting, I'm not even going to suggest boulder outcroppings unless they want them. I mean, what are those boulders doing there in that tiny little yard when there's no boulders within 18 blocks? It's as I've always said, you have to let the environment and the locale influence the design somewhat. You can't put a white picket fence around a stately brick mansion on, one of the wealthiest, largest neighborhoods of a city, but if you've got a beautiful old cottagey house out in the far suburbs or in a small town, the picket fence looks great. The beautiful brick mansion, it needs a black wrought iron fence with spikes on top of it. So you have to let the neighborhood and the proximity of the house to other landscapes influence your design somewhat.
Yeah. Aside from things you see firsthand in gardens, what are some of your favorite sources for new inspiration in the garden?
Oh, the internet's been pretty neat. I mean, I love to just sit down and just search weird stuff and search great gardens and search European gardens. And it makes it so easy now versus the old days of books. Other gardeners, certainly, and other landscapers. But again, as I'd mentioned before, getting out and getting to the nursery, getting out early and touring nurseries, particularly tree and shrub nurseries, and seeing the plants live and seeing what's new is just essential to me.
What's currently inspiring you, Don? What are things that you're really excited about when you go to meet with some of your clients?
Very good question. I think dwarf conifers. I just continue to grow my appreciation of just how amazing some of them are. I was out at a landscape just last weekend that I did about 10 years ago when I did a few dwarf conifers, and now they're 10 years old, and this is a really good. I did the maintenance for about 5 years, and now they do it. She's a good gardener. The homeowner's a good gardener, and she takes care of stuff. And it's just so neat to see these plants. But I love the dwarf conifers because you can use them in a big landscape. You can use them in those small spaces and as focal points and kind of sculptures in a large landscape. And then, of course, they're dwarf conifers. You can use them in small yards. So they really go both. But I think the world of dwarf conifers is just continuing to expand. And is something that I really have the most fun with nowadays. I've been doing some bit of water gardens, and of course those are always fine, but I don't think it's any more inspirational now than it used to be. I think just keeping up with cool new perennials and developing, better looks. I'm not a big, giant perennial garden guy. I see perennials more as the throw pillows that you kind of scatter throughout the landscape. Unless the client wants it, I'm not big on, okay, here's my masked perennial garden. I like them more as the colorful tie on a good wool suit.
You had mentioned before about giving the do-it-yourselfer ideas on how to make their yard more congruent, not to make these small, little, tiny gardens throughout the whole yard. What is the one tip that you would give to a gardener that wants to actually improve their design skills?
The one tip. Yeah, that's hard because, again, even when I say see the whole picture, they go, well, what do you mean? I mean, it takes time. I would say if you're really interested in it, go, do online research or do a community ed class or check out even a lot of the good, certainly in the Twin Cities, Minnesota State Horticultural Society, etc. Look for landscape design classes. I mean, seriously, that and go out and get good books. You want to go to the library or the bookstore and find a book that is just filled with landscapes, and there are many of them out there, and chapter by chapter, and they'll have different shaped yards and different and study them. I mean, I can't say, well, just learn how to design. That isn't a tip, but take the time to learn some basic landscape design. And it's all available in books and online, certainly.
What kind of tips would you be able to give me without seeing my garden? How can I set my garden apart from others' gardens?
Place your plants based on contrast and foliage. Get out there and green is one of 24 colors that are available in shrubs, trees, and perennials when you look at their leaves. That's it. That's the secret to plant placement. Place your plants based on contrast and foliage and plant form. Bloom color is a secondary concern.
Don, how is gardening life-giving to you?
Oh, it's just, it's great exercise. I don't relate it too much. I mean, I was going to say I don't relate it too much in spiritual terms, but it's certainly I know that it is. I mean, it does uplift my soul. I think true gardeners, people who kind of discover that their calling or their main passion is gardening, are just so impressed by the growth, by the will to grow, and sometimes the will to survive, and the nurturing aspect. I've often contended that the reason that some women outnumber men when it comes to gardening, but I think women are, well, I don't think they are by nature more nurturers. I mean, men, we do not give birth. We do not nurse. But growing something, even if it's tomatoes, even if all because men typically are stronger vegetable growers than women. But I think the same thing there. It's an ability for us to nurture. It's an ability for us to help something along and to watch something develop. I think fulfills a need.
I get the impression that you spend a lot of your time with your clients or educating groups of people about gardening. How do you stay connected with your own garden? How do you make sure that you're in your own garden?
I don't. Unfortunately, it's tough. That's why one of the reasons that I actually kind of downsized. I mean, I'm at a point right now where it's the cobbler's children have no shoes. Mm-hmm. No, I'm waiting. I'm hopefully getting out of. I'm planning a move out to the Pacific Northwest, maybe within a year, and then when things slow down a little bit and I don't have to work so hard, I could then retire and create my final garden. That's kind of what I'm looking forward to right now. But no, the worst thing you can do if you're a passionate gardener is start a landscaping company because you have no time to garden.
Well, and it's a tough profession just from the physical labor part of it.
Yeah. Well, I hire good, young, strong backs, but oh yeah, I'm out there every day. But that's the beauty of it. It's fresh air, it's exercise. I'm in incredible shape. I'm in good health because I go out and I actually do. Basically, I'm the one who points and gives instructions. But when it comes time to slam the plants into the ground, I'm digging holes with the rest of them.
Yeah,
teaching young people how to plant and how to prepare a plant for interment and how to mulch properly and how to fertilize, et cetera, and how to prune. But it's a great. I mean, I get paid to go out and garden for other people, so it's not a bad life.
I love asking other gardeners what their favorite garden tools are. So, in other words, when you think of the things that you like to bring to work with you in your garden bag or in your own garden, in your backyard, what are some of your favorite tools that you like to use?
Bobcat. Sooner or later, you got to go out and buy a Bobcat. Buy a big pickup. Don't screw around with those little mid-sized or mini pickup. If you're going to garden, eventually you need to get a big old F-150 or a full-size pickup. Just having, good loppers. Get a good buy good gardening tools. Have a good quality bypass pruner. Have a good long-handled lopper. The Ginsu knife is the greatest gardening tool ever invented. It's now the quick cut, but you see them at the State Fair and at the Home and Garden Show. It's that heavily serrated knife, used to be called a Ginsu, and it slices bread and it slices the tomato and everything. Greatest gardening tool ever made. Cutting edging, dividing perennials. I have about 6 of them in my toolboxes. I am always grabbing my serrated Ginsu bread knife, which has never cut a slice of bread in its life. All it does is help me in the garden. It's for sawing down your grasses in the spring, for dividing perennials. It's the greatest gardening tool ever made.
That's great. Do you have any other tips? Like, do you wear garden gloves? Do you believe in any type of particular product that you just absolutely can't be without when you're in your yard?
Gloves are for when you have a tool in your hand, when you're shoveling, when you're raking, when you're pruning, you wear gloves. Any other time, the gloves immediately come off. Anytime I'm planting, I'm doing stuff. The gloves just get in the way. For me, of course, I do a lot of stonework, so I'm operating stone saws and sophisticated stone grinders and stuff. And there, it's gloves and safety glasses and dust masks and all of that stuff. But my gloves are constantly being taken off when I garden because they just get in the way.
Since you don't have time to spend in your garden at all, when you do finally find time, is there a favorite spot that you find yourself going to in your garden?
It's just my bench. I mean, again, that just comes with good design. People will buy a bench, and then sometimes when I'm speaking to a group, I'll say, "How many of you have a garden bench?" And a lot of them will raise their hand. I'll say, "How many of you sit on it at least every 2 to 3 days?" And a quarter of the people will raise their hand. But yeah, just sitting in the bench, opening my mail, talking on the phone, maybe sitting at my laptop. That's my spot.
Yep, I have a garden swing. That's the spot that I continue to go to time and time again. Do you have a favorite flower or a favorite plant?
I get asked that all the time, and I always beg off. It's impossible to limit it to one perennial, one shrub, one tree. I would say among perennial, I have to have iris. I mean, iris to me is the perfect perennial. It's got that amazing sword foliage. It's got one of the most beautiful flowers you can ever see. I know they're a little short. I know they don't bloom for very long, but a well-maintained iris and the variegated irises. You can't design an attractive perennial garden without iris. I love the new sedums. I love the new cherry truffle and xenon, the dark and burgundy and almost brownish black Sedums are among my favorites, and heuchera. I mean, that would probably round out my absolute favorite perennials. I loved when it comes to shrubs. I mean, my favorites are certainly going to be the 9-barks, just for that fabulous foliage cover, the white Gilias. I use a lot in my designs. Even simple old dumb stuff, the dwarf bush honeysuckle, which is such a terrific plant for massings. And then when it comes into the tree world, the red buds, the birch maples, or rather the river clump maples, the river clump birches is what I'm trying to say, and dwarf conifers. I mean, the small spreading conifers and the pines and the incredible, just artistic spruce that are available now are just continuing to astonish me with their usefulness.
Are there any plants that remind you of your childhood?
Chrysanthemums.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dad's mums. I still always have to have some mums around. Just because they're just so fabulous in the fall. You know, in the fall, people ignore the fall. You got to have Boltonia, you got to have chrysanthemum, you got to have solidago. There's so many fabulous, and a lot of the sedums too will carry you into fall. Chrysanthemums, you got to have stuff blooming in fall.
Yeah, I agree. We just need to also help the birds and the butterflies and the bees that are left in the fall too, that don't have the plants that are necessary to survive. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you could grow any single plant that would come from anywhere in the world, what would you choose?
Japanese maple.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have the typical Zone 7 NB for the Zone 7 Japanese maples. That's why I'm moving to the Pacific Northwest.
And they'll have a wonderful growing season there.
Oh, yeah.
That is going to be a beautiful garden. Don, do you feel that you've successfully shaken some of the perceived rigid rules around gardening during your career?
I think I have, just due to the success of the website. I mean, I get emails from people all across the country and all across the world, really. And, I was one of the early people railing against the overuse of lawn, and I don't know whether, I'm certain that my lone voice didn't have anything to do with it, but there were an awful lot of us who joined in and said, we really have to reevaluate this intense use of lawn. And now, lo and behold, nowadays, even if people still have large lawns, at least they've heard that there are alternatives to large lawns. So everyone starts out and you grow annuals and you grow perennials, and you love perennials, and I love perennials, but you got to move on to shrubs, trees and shrubs. The secret to landscape design is knowing and placing small trees and shrubs. And once you get that part figured out, once you start realizing your options there. So I've just been screaming at people, shrubs. And I've had people come back to me and say, yeah, I didn't know what you were talking about. Now I understand it.
Who was your mentor with regard to trees and shrubs?
Oh, that's a good question. My father, certainly, because my father, he knew his trees. He knew his trees. He could be driving anywhere. He would know every tree, every conifer, every deciduous tree. I'm going to stick with my father. He always grew beautiful shrubs in our yards, and he grew fruiting shrubs, and he probably would be number one.
And that's true for so many gardeners, that they learn to love gardening working beside one of their parents in the garden. I've got 4 kids, and I love having them in the garden with me. What's the most valuable thing that I could teach my own kids about gardening?
Do you grow vegetables with them?
I do. And we also grow herbs and aromatics and, of course, perennials. And then when we're in the vegetable garden or the kitchen garden together, we're harvesting together. So I try to show them the full cycle of growth with the plants, that, from seed to harvest, and what that looks like, and even extending that into the kitchen when we cook together.
Yeah, because that's the best way. That's the best way with kids. I think the most valuable thing you could teach them is that they're alive. These plants are alive. No, they're not human, and they're not the dog, and they don't move a lot, and they don't talk to us. They don't make any sounds, but just understand that it's a live thing. And guess what? It's going to grow just like you are. It's going to get bigger, and it has a life, and it serves a purpose. And of course, the great thing about vegetable gardening is to have kids plant something and grow it, and then eventually eat it.
Yeah.
So that they understand that their food came from the ground.
That's great advice, Don.
Thank you. Top of my head.
Top of your head. Well, you have been a font of wisdom for us today.
Oh, I've enjoyed it, and thank you, too. You had such wonderful questions.
Well, you're welcome. It was a pleasure putting it together for you. I knew that this was going to be a special show for us. So I just want to thank you again for being with me today. And of course, our listeners can always find you at www.renegadegardener.com.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any special upcoming events? I know this is your busy time.
Yeah, and I just came off of a very busy winter and fall, winter and spring speaking schedule. And in the summer, I booked nothing. I'll be speaking again. I know at a lot of local garden clubs. I haven't got my calendar in front of me. This fall, people can always check my website. I put my speaking calendar up there by about midsummer.
Okay.
This winter, I'm booked. I'm going to be, I'll be locally. I'll be at the St. Paul Home and Patio Show again in February, but I'm booked at home and garden shows and flower shows in Michigan and in Pittsburgh, and I'm going to be going to. I'm going to be speaking out in Seattle. I'm just trying to think what I've got. I'm going to be out in the Virginia Beach, Hampton, Virginia area. In February, I will be around the country, and people round about, certainly by fall, on my website, renegadegardener.com. I pop up my 2014 speaking calendar, and at that point, it'll have a lot of my Minnesota and local garden club and spring fling stuff for 2014.
Don, let me know when you post your speaking schedule, and we'll put a link to it on this episode.
Oh, super. It's always fun to check out my website. They can like me on Facebook, and I'll send out gardening tips and photos of the current jobs that we're doing. I usually include some notes as to kind of give some ideas to what we had in mind, or captions to the pictures. And, support your local nurseries. And this will be a weird season, but, no spring in Minnesota is unusual. And I think people are going to wind up having a pretty good year if it ever stops raining.
Sometimes it all catches up in a hurry, doesn't it?
I think so. Who knows? It might turn out to be a gorgeous growing season, and I bet you we're going to have good fall color around the country. So that's always a plus.
Yep, it is. Well, I want to thank you again for being on the show today, as well as Mary Lynn for being a great co-host. Thanks for coming out.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks, Mary Lynn. It was great talking with you folks.
Well, you are a genius. It was wonderful.
Well, I'm a good talker. I talk a good game.
You're a fabulous storyteller. Excellent plantsman. Well, I'll have all the information mentioned on this podcast today at 6footmama.com. That's the number 6FTMAMA.com. And you can find this episode in the top menu under the Still Growing podcast. By the way, I'll put Don's contact information there, as well as a link to his website, renegadegardener.com, and there will be a lot of fun things to reference in the show notes for this episode. Of course, you can find me at facebook.com/stillgrowing with 6footmama, and I'll talk to you all next week. Still Growing with Jennifer Ebling is a 6footmama.com production made in lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota. Episodes and production notes can be found at 6footmama.com in the top menu under Still Growing Podcast. Of course, you can always find me at 6footmama.com or on facebook.com/Still Growing with 6footmama. You can also email me directly at jennifer@6footmama.com. Feel free to send in your questions for the Master Gardener Roundtable, which airs every other month on Still Growing. Your question will be answered either via email or during the podcast. Once again, Still Growing is an hour-long weekly gardening podcast dedicated to helping you and your garden grow. Well, Sonny had a very long day in the garden today, and he found a chipmunk that he just had to get, and he was chasing this thing all around the garden. And tonight, when I was working on editing the show, he was sleeping in the studio, of course, and I'm sure he was dreaming about chasing this chipmunk. But here's what he sounded like in his sleep. Sonny. Sonny. Did you catch the chipmunk? Hmm?